all over the world, you can see that there is at the moment an upsurge of fascist movements. You can see this in Argentina, where a man called Milei, who is a fascist, has got elected. This is true in America, where Trump has got re-elected. And you may have noticed that on Trump's swearing in, one of his closest friends, Elon Musk, actually gave a Nazi salute of the 1930s, with which the Nazis used to salute one another and say, "Heil Hitler." You find that the fascist forces have again taken over Hungary, where Orban, the current leader of that country, is a fascist. In Italy, there is a fascist government which actually traces its origin to Mussolini's party. You find that in Turkey, there is Erdogan, who is again, in every conceivable way, corresponds to the description of a fascist movement and a fascist party. In India, there is Modi, who is a classical fascist. And of course, where the fascists are not in power, but they are knocking on the doors of power, you still have powerful fascist movements like in France, Marine Le Pen, and in Germany, AfD. So there is a real upsurge of fascism all over the world. It has all the features of old fascism, but it is in a new context. Therefore, it has certain new characteristics, which I will describe later on. But the question arises, why is there this upsurge of fascism? All the features of old fascism you observe today. What are these features? Firstly, you have the use of state repression against political opponents, against intellectuals, against critics, against students, against anybody who happens to disagree with the ruling establishment. So you have state repression. But one of the characteristics of fascism is that the state repression is supplemented by repression with the help of fascist gangs, youth gangs. Mussolini had his gang called Balailas, who were the youth gangs of the fascists, and they went around terrorizing people. The third feature of fascism, which is very important, of course, is that fascism is always very close to monopoly capital. Mussolini defined fascism as the merger of state and corporate power. So the fact that the corporates come close to the state, in fact the state and corporate power merge and you cannot distinguish between where one ends and the other begins. So the fascists are always close to corporate power, to monopoly capital. The fourth feature is that it is particularly close to some segment, a new segment of monopoly capital. We see in India, Adani, Ambani are particularly close to Modi. We also find that in Japan, military fascism, the Zaibatsu, the old monopoly capital was there. They supported the fascists, but among them, there was a particularly new group called Shinko Zaibatsu, which was very close to the military fascists. In Germany, there were the old monopolies in industries like textiles and so on, but you had a new group of monopolists in producer goods, in armaments, who were particularly close to the fascists, like Krupps and so on. So everywhere you find that whether in old fascism or new fascism, there is a closeness of the fascists with a particularly new segment of monopoly capital. The fifth feature, which of course is a defining feature of fascism, is that it always targets a small ethnic or linguistic or religious minority group. It was the Jews in Hitler's time, it is the Muslims and Christians in particularly religious minorities in India, and it is, as far as Trump is concerned, the immigrants, the Chinese, the immigrants, the Mexicans. So it always targets, it actually makes into the other, a small minority, targets that minority and generates hatred against that minority within the majority. One other feature which also you find in old fascism and today is the cult of the leader. You had in the old days in Germany, for instance, the Führer, that basically there is an inversion of the relationship between the people and the leader. It is not the people who are the source of power, and the leader is only a representative of the people, but the leader is the source of power, and the people acquire power only to the extent that they follow the leader. So the cult of the leader is something which is a very important feature of fascism. All these features which were there earlier are features which you again find in today's fascism. Fascist groups exist in all modern capitalist societies, but usually they are a fringe element. They come center stage and even acquire power when they are supported by monopoly capital, and they are supported by monopoly capital through media support and financial support. And monopoly capital supports them only in a period of crisis of capitalism, when the hegemony of monopoly is under threat. When this hegemony is under threat because of the crisis, monopoly capital attempts to change the discourse so that people are not talking about the crisis, they are not talking about the distress they face under the crisis, but they are talking about the other. They are talking about hatred against a religious minority. They are talking about building a temple. They are talking about the Jews or whatever. So there's a change in discourse from material conditions of life to all these othering of a minority, and therefore holding it up as an object of hatred, and the discourse is shifted in that direction. And this also helps monopoly capital because it divides the working people. It divides the potential challengers to its hegemony. Therefore, monopoly capital helps the fascist groups to come center stage and, if possible, to acquire power. And this is something which therefore gives rise to an alliance between monopoly and the fascist elements. In India, it takes the form of the corporate Hindutva alliance. And as a matter of fact, Modi was promoted as the prime ministerial candidate at an investors' meet held in Gujarat when he was chief minister, which was attended by all the leading elements of the Indian monopoly capitalist class, and they unanimously decided to make him the next prime minister. So monopoly is at the center of the emergence of fascism, and this happens in a period of crisis. And in this period of crisis, monopoly wants to form an alliance because of which they can bring about a discourse shift and disunite the working class challenge to its hegemony. It's of some interest that that the fact that this happens is precisely something which we saw in the 1930s, and this is something that we are actually seeing even today. The contemporary global emergence of fascism, therefore, is because of the crisis of neoliberal capitalism. Even in the 1930s, it was the crisis of capitalism, the Great Depression, mass unemployment that it generated, which had brought the fascists to the forefront and in many countries to power. Likewise, today it is the crisis of neoliberal capitalism which actually has made monopoly capital make common cause with the fascists to defend its hegemony, and it is this which has brought the fascists to power. Before the crisis, it was possible to pretend that even though people were pushed into greater and greater distress by neoliberalism, it was possible to pretend that tomorrow, day after tomorrow, there would be some trickle-down effect of this growth that is taking place for you. That even though today you may not be getting any effects of this trickle down, tomorrow you are going to benefit from it. Or if you don't benefit from it, your children would benefit from it. So there was a prop which neoliberal capitalism had, which was that the accelerated rate of GDP growth, which they claimed the economy was having, though now there are lots of doubts which have been raised about this growth rate acceleration, but at least they claim that this is something which is going to benefit everybody, if not today, then over a period of time. With the crisis, you cannot have that pretense anymore. You cannot then pretend that this growth is going to benefit everybody because there is very little growth. And moreover, mass unemployment is there for everybody to see, because of which it becomes necessary for monopoly capital to come and take the help of the fascist elements, and you have this alliance that actually brings fascists to power with monopoly support. The crisis of neoliberal capitalism is not because of COVID-19, is not because of some accidental developments that took place. It is essential to the nature of neoliberal capitalism. Under neoliberal capitalism, there is an enormous increase in economic inequality. There's an increase in economic inequality so that the share of economic surplus in world output and in the output of every country increases. Why does that happen? It happens because when you look at the advanced capitalist countries, the workers in the advanced capitalist countries cannot get wage increases, because if they go on strike demanding higher wages, then capital is going to say, we shall shift our plant to Indonesia, we shall shift our plant to Bangladesh, or to India, or to some other country. Therefore, the global mobility of capital beats down the workers in the advanced countries. At the same time, the global mobility of capital does not strengthen the workers in the third world. It does not strengthen the workers' position in the countries to which capital shifts. Why? Because of the fact that during neoliberal capitalism, there is also an assault on the peasants, on petty producers, and this assault means many of them have to leave their occupations and look for jobs. So the reserve army of labor, the labor reserves do not diminish in relative size compared to the labor force, despite capital coming in and despite even any acceleration in growth rate. Additionally, under neoliberal capitalism, there is also a rise in the rate of growth of labor productivity. And of course, if there is a rise in the rate of growth of labor productivity, then there is correspondingly a shrinking in the rate of growth of employment. Therefore, under neoliberal capitalism, advanced countries' workers suffer because capital moves elsewhere or threatens to move elsewhere. The elsewhere workers suffer because even if capital comes into their countries, there is the assault on petty production, and there is also a much higher rate of technological change, because of which the unemployment or the labor reserves do not fall. And therefore, workers all over the world are pushed into a weaker position compared to what they enjoyed earlier. And this is something which basically means that while labor productivity rises, wages don't rise, because of which the surplus rises. The share of surplus rises. In India, this is quite well known. Whatever estimates exist show that this is according to Piketty and others, who are the French economists. They have set up a World Inequality Lab, which actually makes estimates for all countries about economic inequality. In 1982, the top 1% of India's population had 6% of the total national income. This was a fall compared to the time of independence, when the top 1% had about 12% of the national income. So there's some fall. Now, the same top 1%, even before they came to power, by 2012-13, had got almost 21 point something, that is close to 22%. Now, after Modi has been in power, this share has increased to 22.6%, which is the highest it has been over the last century. Over the last 100 years, economic inequality measured by the share of the top 1% of population in total national income has not been as high as it is today. And it is not surprising that when economic inequality rises, and this is true all over the world, in fact in America, the estimate is that the average real wage of a male industrial worker in 2011 is marginally lower in absolute terms compared to 1968. So this is something you find everywhere in the neoliberal period. And if this happens, then of course the crisis is inevitable. If you give a rupee to a working person, the working person would more or less consume the entire rupee. If you give the same rupee to a rich person, in that case the rich person would consume, let's say, half the rupee or quarter of the rupee and put the rest in the pocket, saying, I may consume it day after tomorrow. And therefore, every rupee so transferred reduces consumption demand, and therefore gives rise to a crisis of overproduction. This is the crisis that we find all over the world today, and of course we find in India. It is very important to remember that under neoliberalism, not only the workers in the advanced countries, but the workers in the third world, workers across the world suffer. Neoliberalism is an effort to assert the dominance of capital over labor, in a way that in the post-war period there had been a certain slight shift in the balance in favor of the workers, because of which the welfare state legislations got implemented in many advanced countries. Now, neoliberalism reverses that, and it's very important to see that both workers, working class everywhere, suffers under neoliberalism. I had once been invited by a group of Spanish trade unions to go and speak to them. So when I was talking to them about the growing unemployment in India, they looked extremely surprised. They said, but we thought our unemployment here is because capital is shifting to your country. But if capital is shifting to your country, your unemployment should be getting reduced. Then how is it that you also are talking about growing unemployment? It's because of the fact that neoliberalism is not only mobility of capital, neoliberalism also means an assault on petty production, on peasant production, a quickening of the tempo of technological progress, and so on. It involves a whole package of measures because of which the workers everywhere suffer on account of neoliberalism. And the point is, this is why I'm now going to talk about the difference between old fascism and new fascism. The difference arises from the fact that new fascism cannot do anything about unemployment anywhere as long as it remains within the neoliberal fold. Why? You see, if you have the state increasing its expenditure, I said there's not enough demand for the produced goods because consumption is not rising, because income distribution is going against the working people in the country. If so, then you can say that, okay, but the state can come in and boost the demand for goods through state spending. But state spending can boost the demand for goods only if it is financed either by not taxing anybody at all, which means basically enlarging the fiscal deficit. The state spends 100 rupees, but it doesn't tax anybody, it simply prints the 100 rupees. Therefore, there is a net increase in demand of 100 rupees. But if the state actually spends 100 rupees by taxing the rich, who, let us say, may be spending 50 rupees out of the 100 that they hand over to the state, then there is net increase. Their demand goes down by 50, state demand goes up by 100, there is a net increase in demand of 50. But if the state taxes the working people who more or less consume their entire income and spends that, then there is no net increase in demand. Their demand goes down by 100, state demand goes up by 100, and therefore there is no net increase in demand. There will be a net increase in demand only if state expenditure is financed either by a fiscal deficit or is financed by taxing the rich. Both these are ruled out in today's world because in globalized finance capital does not want either way of financing government expenditure. Old fascism had overcome the crisis by running a larger fiscal deficit. Japan was the first country to come out of the Great Depression and to overcome unemployment in 1931 itself. Germany came out of the crisis and overcame mass unemployment when Hitler came to power in 1933. What all these governments did is that they ran a fiscal deficit. They didn't tax the rich. They ran a fiscal deficit in order to enlarge state expenditure for armaments, to rearm those countries so that they could do their military exploits, because of which they managed to overcome the unemployment that had characterized the entire world during the Great Depression. How could they do it? Because after all, finance capital would have been opposed to a fiscal deficit. It always is opposed to a fiscal deficit. How could they do it? Because they had to confront national finance capital. Hitler could persuade the German financiers that don't worry, we are with you and you allow us to enlarge the fiscal deficit, nobody is going to do any harm to you, because naturally capital gets worried if you have larger state spending, that tomorrow then people are going to come and say, if you need the state to enlarge employment, then why do we need the capitalists? But this is something which would not happen with the fascists there, because there is no next government. There is no next government, and therefore the Japanese and the German military fascists, the Japanese military fascists and German Nazis could persuade national finance capital that was necessarily national, not to worry as they enlarge their fiscal deficits. But today, finance is globalized. You have international finance capital facing the nation state. No nation state can convince the international finance capital, don't worry, because international finance capital is then going to say, okay, maybe we don't have to worry, but nonetheless, to be on the safe side, we will locate, or we will move out of your country and go to Bangladesh. We will move out of your country and go to Czechoslovakia, whatever. So that if you have international finance capital and the nation state, in that case, there is necessarily the case that the nation state has to obey the dictates of international finance capital in a neoliberal regime, and therefore it cannot pursue the kind of government expenditure expansion policy that might give rise to greater employment. In fact, old classic fascism, because it could do this, there was a brief period, say in Germany, when full employment had got established. Germany came out of the Great Depression, but the horrors of the war had not yet started. Therefore, there was a brief period of about 5 years or 6 years during which the Nazis became quite popular. They became popular because the unemployment was behind the country. It had been overcome, and the horrors of the war had not yet started. But that is not possible in today's world because of the fact that you have nation state, and therefore the government of the nation state facing international capital. Therefore, its writ cannot run vis-a-vis international capital, and international capital's opposition to a fiscal deficit basically implies that the national government's hands are also tied. If it taxes the rich, if it runs a fiscal deficit, capital would leave the country, finance would leave the country and go elsewhere. Why do you think there is a Fiscal Responsibility Act in our country, where the central government cannot spend more than 3% of GDP, state governments cannot spend more than 3% of their GDP in the form of a fiscal deficit? There's a limit to fiscal deficit. Why? We don't have a minimum to the spend, or to what the government can spend on education. We don't have a minimum to what the government can spend on healthcare. Why do we have a maximum to what the government can spend by way of fiscal deficit? Because finance wants it. And what finance wants has to be done in a neoliberal context, in an economy that is open to financial flows. Therefore, neo-fascism is incapable of even doing the kind of things for overcoming unemployment that old fascism had done. This has very important implications. Old fascism was defeated by communism. Basically, 1930s fascism was defeated by the Red Army of the Soviet Union. Today, many people are worried, how do we defeat this neo-fascism? Neo-fascism cannot be defeated by simply liberal elements coming to power to pursue once more the neoliberal economic policy. If neo-fascism is the product of the crisis of neoliberalism. In that case, we have to overcome the crisis we have to create conditions so that the crisis is overcome if neo-fascism is to be overcome. The conjuncture underlying neo-fascism must be overcome if we are going to overcome neo-fascism. If that is not the case, even if they may get defeated, they'll come back, like Trump has come back. Trump was defeated and everybody celebrated, saying, yes, democracy has triumphed, but Trump is back. Why is he back? Because of the fact that as long as the crisis continues, you have the relevance of the neo-fascism. You have the historical necessity for the alliance between monopoly capital and neo-fascism, and because of that, neo-fascism comes back. You have to overcome the crisis, and you cannot overcome the crisis without going beyond neo-fascism. Since the crisis, as I mentioned, is a part of the functioning of neo-fascism itself. It's not some accidental phenomenon. It's not some external phenomenon. In order to overcome the crisis, you have to go beyond neo-fascism. And this is something which is very clearly visible when you look at the world. Everywhere, liberal elements that support neoliberal economic policies are losing out. France is the classic example. Emmanuel Macron, he called an election thinking he's going to win. As a matter of fact, he came third. You have in India exactly the same thing, namely that the ruling party committed to neo-fascism actually lost. Similarly, you have in Sri Lanka, the ruling formation which was committed to, in quotes, reforms lost. Wherever you have had the ruling liberal formations committed to neoliberalism, they have actually lost. There is a hollowing out. There is a weakening of the so-called center. And therefore, to replace the neo-fascists by a centrist formation committed to neoliberalism is out of the question. What is required is, of course, the coming together of all the oppositional forces, but the coming together of the oppositional forces on the basis of an agenda that goes beyond neoliberalism. It is that which is essential, and I believe the left has to play a very important role in pushing that agenda. I do not simply have in mind giving 1,500 rupees per month to women, or giving this or that little bit of help. I'm all for it. Yes, of course, very good to the extent you can give that help. But that is not enough to overcome the crisis. Any such transfer is something which really does not make a big difference in the totality of things. Inflation is taking place at a high rate, and therefore people's real incomes are shrinking. And giving these transfers, very good, but these transfers do not necessarily overcome the distress to which people are being subjected because of the neoliberalism and the crisis of neoliberalism. What is required is really an alternative vision. This alternative vision, I can give a suggestion. The suggestion, for instance, is that this alternative vision must mean that people must have certain rights. It is not that the government is doing a favor. It is not that some other political formation comes and says, oh, they have given you 1,500 rupees, we will give you 2,000 rupees. It's not a question of doing favors to the people. It is not a question of people becoming beggars to whom you can actually give a little bit here or a little bit more there and so on. They must have certain fundamental rights. I shall just give the results of some calculation which I made and then move on. If you institute in the country 5 fundamental economic rights, which are like the political rights and civil rights that currently exist in the Indian Constitution, these 5 rights being the right to food, which means everybody gets food at an affordable price, like was the case before COVID, which was for the BPL population. Everybody should get whatever the BPL population was getting. The right to free publicly funded education, the right to free publicly funded universal health care through a national health service, the right to employment, failing which you have to be paid a full wage, and the right to old age, a living old age pension and disability benefits. I calculated 3,000 rupees a month. This probably has to be increased now. But if you have these 5 rights, they can be financed by having 2 taxes imposed on the top 1% of the population. One is a wealth tax of 2%. In other words, on the top 1% of the population, if they just paid a wealth tax of 2%, and an inheritance tax, that means whenever I pass down my wealth to my children or to relatives, I should be able to pay a tax. I should be forced to pay a tax, and I calculated 1/3 inheritance tax. By the way, in Japan, you have 55% inheritance tax. Even in advanced capitalist countries, you have 40%. In India, 0. So if you pay 1/3 inheritance tax and 2% wealth tax, both levied only on the top 1% of the population, you can build a welfare state where all these 5 fundamental economic rights can be financed. This is just an illustration. What I'm trying to say is that we can act. Today, when we are talking about defeating neo-fascism, you have to have an agenda of forming a welfare state financed by taxing the wealth of these super rich, of the billionaires and so on. It's only with that that you will be able to move people to support an alternative agenda, to get them out of this religious fanaticism in which the neo-fascists are trying to trap them. Inheritance tax, the reason why I said Japan had 55%, the United States is 40%, UK has 40%. Why? How come that they are taxing their capitalist countries? Why are they taxing the capitalists so heavily when they pass on their property? These are death duty rates. Now the point is that the philosophy of capitalism, those who advocate capitalism, they say that, look, the capitalists have some special property. Why do they earn a profit? The Marxists say they earn a profit because they exploit the workers. But the capitalists say, no, we don't exploit the workers. We have some special property because of which we earn these profits. Let us assume that they have some special property. But their children must have that property before they can be entitled to earn profits. They can be entitled to get that wealth. And if the children do not show that special property, in that case, they have no legitimate reason for getting this wealth passed on to them. So inheritance goes against capitalism's own defense of the capitalists earning a profit. And that is why most capitalist countries actually have fairly high rates of inheritance taxation. In India, we don't have any inheritance taxation. 0. Today I saw in the newspaper somebody has referred to capitalists as wealth creators, which is ridiculous. But suppose they are wealth creators. But then Mr. Adani's son is not a wealth creator. Mr. Ambani's son is not a wealth creator. Let him create wealth, and after that, he may be able to be allowed to enjoy the benefits of this wealth. But why should he inherit his father's wealth? Because he didn't create it. Therefore, inheritance taxation, or the absence of it, is shocking as far as the Indian case is concerned. We have to have these taxes. The moment you have these taxes, there would be opposition from globalized finance. You would have financial outflows taking place. If financial outflows take place, you will have to have capital controls. You have to prevent outflows from taking place. If you prevent outflows from taking place, then inflows of finance will not come, because why should they come into a country from where they can't take out their money? If inflows don't come, then you would not be able to meet your balance of payments deficit. We have more imports than exports, and we have been meeting them through the inflows of finance from abroad. So if we don't have these inflows, then our trade deficit cannot be financed. If the trade deficit cannot be financed, in that case, you will have to have controls on imports. If you have controls on imports, then many goods which are currently available would not be available. And if that is the case, then many in the middle class would get upset. Many, even in the working class, working people might get upset. So the point is that any such move towards a welfare state is going to be painful in the transitional period. There is no question of it being a very enjoyable experience for everybody. In the long run, yes, but immediately it is going to disrupt the economy, it's going to be painful. We have to be prepared for that. The working people have to be ready for that. They have to be educated about that so that they are willing to make the sacrifices necessary for building a welfare state over a period of time. Fortunately, the current situation is quite propitious for this. You look at, for instance, Venezuela. Look at the difficulty that President Maduro is having, because quite apart from these difficulties I've been talking about, Americans impose sanctions upon you. And if that is the case, then of course half the world doesn't trade with you, in which case goods are not available. Therefore, you have to be prepared for the kind of pain that the transitional period would bring. But now we are in a situation where the conditions are propitious for a change. I say that the current condition is propitious for getting out of the crisis and building a welfare state, because of the fact that a united front against imperialism is building up. Who would have thought that Iran, a Muslim theocracy, China, a country which has been fighting imperialism for years, Russia, which is headed by a Putin, all of them would come together in order to challenge the hegemony of imperialism. Therefore, there is a new wind that is blowing, and it's very important that in this new situation, we should realize that the conditions favor a struggle against imperialism. They favor a struggle against global finance capital that is backed by imperialism. And this, therefore, is a very propitious moment to build up the anti-fascist movement, and to make the anti-fascist movement a reality by joining the united front that is building up against imperialism. You see, if imperialism imposes sanctions against one country, then of course that country will have a very difficult time. If imperialism imposes sanctions against 2-3 countries, even then those countries will have a very difficult time. But if imperialism imposes sanctions against 1/3 of the total list of countries in the world, which is roughly the case now, one form or the other of sanctions have been imposed against 1/3 of the countries of the world. In that case, those countries would come together. Then they would build an alternative arrangement. They would then say, okay, we are not a part of your arrangement, we are going to be separate. That is the de-dollarization talk that is going on. And that is the talk about having alternative trade arrangement that is going on. Therefore, today, when there's a talk about alternative arrangements going on, when the economic order dominated by imperialism is being seriously challenged, is a propitious time for us to, in fact, make our anti-neo-fascist struggle and merge it into an anti-imperialist struggle and move towards a welfare state, which is the only way that we can actually go beyond neoliberalism. We must see not only the power of imperialism, but also the defeat of imperialism. The Gaza agreement, it was a genocide that Israel was carrying on against the Palestinian people with the support of the entire West. So much so that even students were not allowed to organize protests against it. But Israel has not met any of its military objectives and has been forced to have an agreement with Hamas ending bringing about a ceasefire. So that is a defeat of imperialism. In Ukraine, we are again going to see a defeat of imperialism. So we must not only get impressed by the power of imperialism, we must see that imperialist structure, imperialist hegemony is being challenged and successfully challenged in a number of cases. And we should, in fact, join the ranks of those who are challenging imperialist hegemony and in the process bring about a welfare state in our country. Thank you very much.